And welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. So I thought I'd firstly start by asking who here has ever been flooded? Show of hands. Okay, we've got a few. And how about people who know someone who've been flooded? Hands up as well. Okay, a lot more. So this is what I've been finding actually over the last 12 years of working in flood risk. We in this room might all be interested in flooding, but generally I've found either more people have been impacted themselves or know someone who've been impacted by flooding. So 10 years ago, when I said I work in flood risk, people would say, oh, that's a bit niche. And now the response is, oh wow, that's a really important industry. So a lot more people are clearly talking about flooding. So who am I? Well, I'm Simon Crowther, a civil engineer, chartered water and environment manager, and fellow of SciWEM. And you might know me as the flood guy. Well, the flood guy actually stemmed from Sky News. Whenever there was flooding, they asked me to appear. And on numerous occasions, they'd say, oh, the flood guy's here. And so I thought, well, if people are actually going to call me that, I better own it. So that's what I did and registered the trademark, and I now am the flood guy. But when my career progresses, I also trademarked the flood father. But I don't think I'm quite there yet, so we'll save that one for another day. So where did my interest in flooding begin? Well, here is my family home in 2007. We were flooded 5 times that summer. This predated surface water flood maps, and so we had no idea that we were at risk of flooding. There's a small stream that runs through the village, which is often dry in, well, I was going to say summer months, but this is the summer. So I'll show you a clip from the flooding that was shown on ITV in 2007, and I'll apologise for how blurry it is. We recorded it on VHS, and if there's any Gen Z in the audience, they're going to think I'm really old that we even had VHS. But here we go.
Flood warnings as torrential rains hit the East Midlands.
Almost a month's worth of rain has fallen in parts of the region in just 24 hours.
There have been floods before, but people who've lived here all their lives say they've never seen it coming down here.
That's the top story in the East Midlands this Monday evening. With no sign of the rainfall easing, the Met Office is warning there's more to come. The Environment Agency says hundreds of homes across the East Midlands are still at risk of flooding. They say people should be ready to take precautions, sandbag their homes and switch off the gas and electricity.
This little stretch of water, described by locals as a trickle into the Trent, became a raging torrent last night following that torrential rain. People woke up to 3 foot deep of water racing through here, down to Loudon, Woodborough and beyond. For residents, it was chaos at times. The effects of the floodwaters were devastating.
The waters just kept on coming. This is what people were waking up to this morning at Lamley in Nottinghamshire and other villages nearby. For Paul and Kate Crowther and their family in Woodborough, the whole of the ground floor of their house was calf deep in floodwater.
It's the 3rd time this week we've been flooded. This is the worst one so far. It's sort of been about a couple of inches higher than the skirting boards this time. But all the residents who've lived here all their lives say that they've never known it this bad before.
The stream that runs through Lamley overflowed as the torrential rain set in. For the residents here, it was a question of hoping and praying it wouldn't come into their homes.
So we were out of the house for nearly a year, and there was an insurance claim for £120,000. We never wanted to go through that process again. And we took measures to defend the property, which over the years have been altered, maintained and tweaked to make the flooding as stress-free as possible. And ultimately, the house hasn't flooded since. We were really ahead of the curve in terms of resistance and recoverability. The property has flood defences, including flood barriers, an automatic water pump, non-return valve. But inside, we also wanted to make sure that if it did flood again, any damage was minimal. So we replaced wooden floors with ceramic tiles and raised what we could off the ground. We even had doors that could lift off their hinges. The garage was sealed and racking fitted so nothing touched the ground, and the electrics were raised above the flood level. We also purchased a Canadian product called a watergate barrier and kept it in the garage, hoping we'd never need to use it. But 5 years later, in 2012, the heavens opened once again and the main street became like a brown, fast-flowing river. We rolled out the watergate and it saved the home. Neighbours were so impressed they wanted one too, frustrated with sandbags. I contacted the manufacturers and Flood Protection Solutions Limited was born, bringing Watergate to the UK. We've since sold the property, but the measures have continued to work. The present owners redid the driveway and asked us to supply a demountable flood barrier when they had the driveway redone last year. And these are some images from Storm Babette. And again, the house stayed dry. So about our company, well, as a company, we've grown over the last 12 years. We're now a group organisation with a goal of accurately assessing risk through to managing it. And in our consulting arm, FPS Environmental, we undertake the Environment Agency's risk assessments and surveys as a framework partner. We work with a wide breadth of clients, from individual homeowners through to councils and businesses, both at home and overseas. Defending an existing property isn't necessarily a simple process. It can be costly, and good advice is hard to come by. And a study showed that most people have to be flooded 3 times before they even consider taking action. So many of us have previously been told or heard, oh, it was a once-in-a-lifetime flood. Oh, blame the council, it's the Environment Agency. Someone needs to fix the problem. Now, we here all know that flooding can't be fixed. We have to reduce and manage the risk as best as possible. There have been grant schemes, such as the £5,000 scheme to spend on flood resistance measures, but these have had significant issues, and to name a few, though the value hasn't increased since 2015, so it doesn't touch the sides. It includes VAT, as though flood defences are a luxury good. The rollout is so slow, meaning the window of opportunity is often missed. For instance, it can be very effective to tank the inside of a property before it's replastered, but often by the time you get to do the survey, the property's already been refitted and the wooden flooring's back down, and you know that that's going to have to come up again in another flood. Also, the surveys which are required in the latest run of this scheme, they've all been payable up front, meaning it's a grant for those who already have the means to pay. I worked with a lady recently, and she had to borrow the money for the survey in the hope that she could then access the grant. Ultimately, some of these issues have caused a lack of trust in property flood resilience, where people don't invest at all. We've also had issues where people think it's a £5,000 fix, because again, everyone wants to fix the problem, and it's more of a management approach than that. And if we come on to flood insurance, I've got some lovely people here from Flood Re in the audience as well, so please do chat to them afterwards. They have a great scheme. But in my talk, I was going to say the market is actually skewed a little bit by Flood Re, because it means flood insurance is actually affordable and accessible for most, when the reality is it wouldn't be otherwise, and it's not for commercial properties. So Flood Re is a joint initiative between the UK government and the insurance industry designed to make flood insurance more affordable and accessible for homes at high risk of flooding. Launched in 2016, it operates as a not-for-profit reinsurance scheme, allowing insurers to pass on the financial risk of flood-related claims. Homes built before 2009 are generally eligible, ensuring legacy properties are covered, but new developments are excluded to discourage building in flood-prone areas. Funded by a levy on insurers, Flood Re helps homeowners secure affordable premiums and excesses while encouraging flood resilience measures. It aims to transition to a market where flood risk is fully reflected in premiums by 2039. Now, they have a scheme called Build Back Better, meaning that properties have been flooded might be able to access £10,000 to spend on monies towards making the property more resilient to flooding, so that if any water does come in, the damage is much, much less, and the idea being they don't need an insurance claim, and it's the first of its kind in the world. I was fortunate enough to be asked to introduce Build Back Better to Parliament, which you can see in the picture here. And whilst it's a great scheme, it's no silver bullet, as it relies on properties being flooded before we consider recoverable repair. Now, I mention it skews the market a little, as it's making insurance affordable in high-risk areas. But if we compare that with commercial properties where flood re does not apply, many properties are uninsurable. And I'm currently working with a client to design a whole new site drainage and SUD scheme where their commercial property isn't insurable due to flood risk. And it's hoped through extensive modelling we'll be able to better manage that risk. So with regards to insurance, current data shows around 25% of homes in the UK are at risk of flooding. Well, we've only got 15 years left before Flood Re exits the market, and that will pass very quickly. So we've got 15 years to ensure our existing housing stock is insurable. And if we don't take action, huge swathes of properties could be uninsurable. Now, this doesn't apply to properties built after 2009. The idea being we cannot support developers who wish to continue to build in flood risk areas, and they must take suitable measures to ensure flood risk is managed, bringing us nicely back to the title of our talk, as anything new must be planned and built to avoid flooding. We're also starting to see mortgage lenders being very concerned about flood risk. Almost daily, as a company, we're getting inquiries from concerned parties saying a mortgage company won't lend. And we've seen articles about Nationwide not lending to properties at risk of flooding. So I've set the scene with regards where we are now. And it's clear why we need to focus on the importance of flood planning in new developments. We're going to see more houses being built. The UK faces a pressing need to increase its housing stock to accommodate a growing population and address the housing crisis. Chancellor Rachel Reeves has outlined an ambitious strategy to build 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years, with a focus on sustainable development and revitalising urban areas. This plan includes reinstating mandatory housing targets for local authorities, reforming planning regulations to expedite construction, and encouraging the use of brownfield sites to preserve green spaces. Rachel Reeves' strategy emphasises accelerating construction by addressing barriers like excessive bureaucracy and local opposition, often referred to as NIMBYism, or not in my backyard. The goal is to reduce delays and make projects less vulnerable to opposition from local groups. But one real issue here is to make sure that flood risk is not overlooked. And again, if we come back to the importance of flood planning, I want to challenge my own title here. Because is it planning or is it execution? Whilst flood planning is vital, the real challenge can often lie in execution. Many developments have detailed flood risk assessments and mitigation strategies that might look perfect on paper. There can be then a gap, though, between the paper and the reality, which can stem from poor implementation, inadequate follow-up, or insufficient maintenance. So really, is it about planning, or is it about ensuring those plans are effectively executed and monitored? Developers and planners need to think beyond meeting minimum requirements and focus on long-term resilience. For instance, if drainage systems aren't maintained or defences aren't regularly inspected, even the best plans can fail. One example I can think of here is where I wrote a flood risk assessment for the development of a former school's playground. It was in a flood risk area, but the assessment included raising the finished floor level above the flood level, compensatory storage by lowering the driveway area, and a robust surface water design to minimise any surface water flooding. This was around about 5 years ago, and I visited the site recently. The flood risk assessment was approved, the land was developed, and when I went, I was horrified. The land hadn't been lowered, in fact, quite visibly raised. I couldn't see any surface water scheme. I mean, there might be soakaways beneath the ground, but judging by the fact the gardens were all artificial grass, I thought that was the least of their concerns. So time has passed. The properties are sold. Developers often build using a company for each development and then close it. So this wasn't necessarily about planning. The plan, flood risk assessment, was rather excellent. It was about the execution. Seemingly no one enforced the measures. And okay, the properties might be at a lower risk of flooding, they've got raised floor levels, but the ones around it might be less so. Now, do we think this is due to a lack of knowledge from planners, a lack of budget, a lack of resource, or all of the above? I think these should be signed off like building regs are, but the sector's so woefully underfunded, under-resourced and undervalued to even begin to start on that journey. We need to see more done by lead local flood authorities and the Environment Agency to review existing measures in place and to check the performance of current and new designs. We should be checking discharge rates and runoff against policies where we're modelling this. Now, flood risk assessments are often approached with a mindset of how little can we pay and how quickly can we get planning approval. But this short-sighted view, in my opinion, frequently leads to challenges. For example, when additional requirements arise, such as bespoke site modelling, you might get pushback from a client. In some cases, we've even initiated assessments, requested all the necessary data, only to find out the site poses substantial risks and really can't be developed safely, and often leading to frustration despite the clear risks being identified. The industry has to advocate for its value. Engaging a flood risk consultant isn't about obtaining a rubber stamp for planning. It's about accessing expertise and guidance on what's genuinely possible. Consultants provide professional insight, not guarantees for approval. Several factors potentially contribute to an undervaluation of expertise. The type of engineer or flood risk consultant isn't protected, unlike, for instance, doctors or lawyers, which might lead to a lack of respect for their advice. We have an absence of a unified industry body or cohesive voice to champion standards and expertise. And there's pressure on consultants from developers and shareholders to minimise costs and expedite approvals. To move forward, we need a shift in perspective, valuing the expertise that ensures safer, more sustainable developments, rather than treating assessments as mere formalities. Ultimately, working with a flood risk consultant rather than against them at the start of the project can maximise development opportunity. Homes could be placed at lowest flood risk with a great SUD scheme providing amenity value to the development. It's huge value to the developer and to the residents who will ultimately live there. It shouldn't be a tick box exercise, and seemingly quite often in a race to the bottom, that's what it can become. So I'm just saying to everyone, do value your work. If we look at strategic flood risk assessments and local plans, strategic flood risk assessments are meant to form the backbone of a council's local plan, ensuring that development is directed to appropriate areas and that flood risks are properly accounted for. In theory, they should provide a comprehensive understanding of flood risk across a local authority's area, enabling informed decisions about land use and planning. But the reality is often very different. Many councils' strategic flood risk assessments are severely out of date, failing to reflect the increased frequency and severity flooding causes, with climate change, urban creep, and other evolving factors. These outdated assessments can lead to poor planning decisions, with developments potentially being approved in areas that would likely fail scrutiny under updated data. Without up-to-date strategic flood risk assessments, the local plan can become fundamentally flawed. It's like building a house on shaky foundations. The lack of accurate current data undermines the ability to create flood-resilient communities. Updating strategic flood risk assessments is not just a technical exercise, it's a necessity to ensure that planning policies are fit for purpose in an era of increasing flood risk. Again, I wonder why this isn't done. Is it resourcing, is it money, or is it not knowing or not prioritising flood risk? If we look at the sequential test approach, the sequential test in flood planning prioritises developing on low-risk sites first, with high-risk sites avoided unless there are overriding reasons. And whilst this approach provides a structured framework, compromises are often made to meet housing targets and political pressures. The challenge here is balancing the need for sustainable development, ensuring homes are close to schools, transport links, and employment centres, with the necessity of keeping people out of harm's way. The balance is becoming harder to achieve. Developers are facing increased demands to design to high standards, such as achieving greenfield runoff rates or accommodating greater climate change allowances. And these measures are essential for flood resilience, but can add significant costs. And then these costs can impact project viability, particularly for affordable housing. There are, however, opportunities for improvement. Flood resilience requires collaboration. Developers, local authorities, and technology providers must work together. We must audit and maintain the measures that are implemented to check that they perform as they should. To improve flood planning, the National Planning Policy Framework needs to be updated to include clearer enforceable guidelines on flood risk assessments. And incentives could also drive better outcomes. Policy tends to focus on not making risk worse elsewhere, but how about incentives to reduce the risk for others? Developers already pay levies such as Section 106 agreements to local schools, roads and infrastructure, but how about reducing flood risk to the local area? If you're developing land and you could reduce the risk further down in the catchment, could a balancing pond or a storage area be introduced? So many times I see upstream developments focused on not increasing runoff, however not monitored, but how about reducing the risk, slowing the flow, and as a result perhaps being allowed to offset that against the cost of a Section 106 contribution? How about making rainwater harvesting mandatory and looking at the whole water cycle together? There has to be a way to relook and refocus how we see land. We're still waiting for Schedule 3 to be formally enacted. Nothing happens quickly, but we're running short on time. Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act 2010 establishes a framework for the approval and adoption of sustainable drainage systems in new developments. We were expecting it in last year and then this year, and we're still waiting. It was adopted in Wales in 2019. But ultimately though, there isn't enough money in this sector. If Schedule 3 suddenly is enacted and it creates a huge influx of drainage design work, who's going to do it and who's going to review it? I can see that reviews will ultimately be limited and we'll end up with just another tick box exercise. Perhaps we won't see change from government at all, and so as an industry we need to drive it. Lead local flood authorities and the Environment Agency play a crucial role in ensuring developments meet flood risk standards. But as we've said throughout the talk, current policies focus on upfront assessments rather than long-term performance. We can also look at bringing in technology. Technology plays a critical role in flood planning. New tools, predictive analytics, advanced flood mapping. Often developers and planners offers developers and planners a more precise understanding of flood risk. So key takeaways from this. Flood planning is essential, but it's only as effective as its execution. With the right mix of technology, policy enforcement and collaboration, we can create sustainable developments that are resilient to future flood risks. And we need to, all together, embrace innovative solutions and push for higher standards in flood planning. So what I'll do now is open the floor to any questions, and also we have a lot of helpful videos that Claire in the back, our head of marketing, and our team have spent a lot of time making. So feel free to scan the QR code for various videos. Connect with me on LinkedIn if you're not already, and thank you for listening.